Hey guys, tonight we're going to dive into the surprisingly undazzling reality of one of history's most famously glamorous rulers, King Louis XIV of France. I want you to close your eyes and imagine a time machine, not a shiny, futuristic contraption, but a slow, creaking carriage. You're bundled up in scratchy wool, a bit of a chill seeping through the cracks, and you're rattling down a cobblestone road toward the past. You can smell the wood smoke mixed with something less pleasant. Maybe a tannery or a horse stable. Ahead, a palace looms, but it's not the glittering palace you know from the postcards. It's colder, dirtier, and filled with a constant, droning murmur of people. This is the world of the Sun King, before he ever earned his magnificent title. I'm going to be honest. You probably wouldn't survive a single week in this era. The hygiene alone would be an experience. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now, imagine yourself as a little boy, no older than 5, shivering in a great, drafty palace. Your name is Louis Dieudonné. Louis, the God-given. Your father, Louis XIII, is gone. You are, in theory, the most powerful person in France. In reality, you're a child, and your kingdom is tearing itself apart. This is the chaotic reality of the Fronde, a series of civil wars that rip through your childhood. You're dragged from palace to palace, often in the middle of the night, a tiny, terrified pawn in a game of power you don't even understand. One night, you and your mother, the Queen Regent Anne of Austria, are forced to flee Paris in such a hurry that you have to sleep on straw mattresses in a shabby chateau. Historians still argue whether this early trauma was the single most defining event of his life. But it's hard to imagine it wasn't. It certainly shaped your mother's worldview. Anne was a devout, rigid woman, a Spanish Habsburg who saw the world through a lens of deep Catholic piety. She trusted no one but her Italian chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin, and she raised you with a blend of fierce overprotectiveness and emotional distance. Your days are a weird mix of strict religious instruction and political chaos. There's a strange little tidbit: to avoid poison, you are taught to never eat anything that hasn't been prepared in front of you. A rather paranoid but probably very sensible lesson for a king, wouldn't you say? Your mother, meanwhile, is doing her best to hold everything together. She's not a doting parent, not by a long shot. She's a queen first, a mother second, and every choice she makes is filtered through the survival of the dynasty. This means you don't get a lot of hugs, but you get plenty of lessons on the divine right of kings. So, while other kids are just being kids, you're constantly being reminded that you are an instrument of God, and that your every move has eternal consequences. It's a pretty heavy burden for a little guy, and it's a far cry from the opulent, carefree image we have of him. You are, at this point, just a boy named Louis, and you are very, very alone in the biggest house in France. As you grow from a frightened little boy into a teenager, your life remains firmly under the thumb of Cardinal Mazarin. The Cardinal, a shrewd and calculating figure, has been your mother's confidant and chief minister since you were a child. He's a man of immense power, but he's also an outsider, an Italian in a French court, which means he's constantly defending his position. For you, Mazarin is a complicated figure. He's your de facto tutor, the one who is supposed to be preparing you to rule, yet he seems to hold you at arm's length. He teaches you statecraft, diplomacy, and the delicate art of court politics, but he does it with a cold, almost detached efficiency. Historians still argue whether Mazarin deliberately kept you from a formal education to maintain his own power, or if his style of tutelage was simply pragmatic for a king who needed to learn by doing. Either way, you spend your formative years watching, listening, and learning from the sidelines. You're not encouraged to speak up or challenge his authority. It's a lonely existence, and there's a certain melancholy that seems to settle over you. Mazarin's world is not one of lavish parties and extravagant displays of wealth. It's a world of paperwork, negotiations, and endless meetings. He's obsessed with building France's power, but he's also obsessed with building his own personal fortune. You watch as he hoards art, jewels, and vast sums of money, all while the kingdom struggles with debt, One particularly quirky tidbit is that Mazarin was a huge fan of clocks and amassed a collection of over 400 of them. He had them everywhere, a constant ticking reminder of time and his own mortality, or perhaps a way to feel like he was controlling time itself. You, on the other hand, are learning to control your emotions, to keep your thoughts to yourself. You understand, even at a young age, that a king must be an impenetrable fortress. You can't show fear, you can't show weakness, and you definitely can't show doubt. This is a very different kind of childhood than what you might imagine for a monarch. It's less about privilege and more about a rigorous, almost Spartan discipline. Your days are structured around religious services, hunting, and observing the endless machinations of the court. You're a silent observer, a student of human nature, watching as people scheme and plot around you. The political situation is a constant source of tension. The Fronde may have ended, but the nobles who rebelled against your family are still powerful, still a threat. Mazarin's constant reminder is that you can trust no one, that every handshake and every smile is a potential trap. Remember that sense of being alone in the biggest house in France? It never really goes away. It just evolves. Now you're not just a boy. You're a young man who is keenly aware of the weight on his shoulders. You learn to project an air of calm authority, even when you're seething with frustration or doubt. This is the origin story of the Sun King. Not in a blaze of glory, but in a quiet, simmering resentment. You are being molded into a ruler. But in the process, you're also being stripped of a normal life, a normal childhood. The world sees a future king. You see a future of unending duty and immense pressure. And a lot of Mazarin. It's a pretty heavy load to carry. And you're just getting started. Mazarin's hold on you finally loosens when he dies in 1661. You are 22 years old, and for the first time in your life, you are truly on your own. But the groundwork for your public image has already been laid. Not through political maneuvering, but through dance. Yes, dance. You see, the court of France wasn't just about politics and prayers, it was also a place of elaborate ballets, where nobles performed for the king and queen. This was a way to display grace, power, and discipline. And you, Louis, were a surprisingly talented dancer. This is a mainstream historical fact. One of the more famous details of your youth. It was a hobby that had an immense political impact. In 1653, when you were just 15, you took on the most pivotal role of your life in the Ballet de la Nuit, or Ballet of the Night. You appeared as Apollo, the god of the sun, rising from the darkness to bring light and order. You wore a magnificent costume, all gold and feathers, with rays of light sprouting from your head. The symbolism was impossible to miss. You weren't just a king, you were the sun. You were the center of the universe, around which all others must revolve. This wasn't a sudden, grand declaration. It was a carefully choreographed performance, a slow burn of a branding campaign. Historians still argue whether you consciously chose the role for its political weight or if you were just a young man who really enjoyed dancing and happened to be good at it. Whatever the initial motivation, the impact was undeniable. The image of the Sun King was born on that stage. This role gave you an identity, a purpose beyond simply being a monarch. It was a way to project power, to show the world that you were not just a boy king, but a force of nature. It was a powerful tool of propaganda, one that you would use for the rest of your life. Your reign officially begins with a meeting of the ministers shortly after Mazarin's death. The head of the council, a man named Jean-Baptiste Colbert, probably expects you to appoint a new chief minister. Instead, you famously declare, "I have called you together to tell you that up to this moment I have been pleased to allow my affairs to be governed by the late cardinal. It is now time for me to govern them myself. You will assist me with your advice when I ask for it." A collective gasp probably echoes through the room. You have taken control. This is the moment your personal reign truly begins. And you do so by immediately subverting expectations. You see, everyone assumed you were just a puppet, a shy young man who would let a new cardinal pull the strings. They were wrong. You had been watching, learning, and waiting. The melancholy, the quiet observation, the silent resentment, it had all been a slow preparation for this moment. This is a very different image from the boisterous, all-powerful king of legend. It's a quieter, more calculated power. This decision to rule without a chief minister was unprecedented and it shocked the court. You were a micromanager. You insisted on reading every state document, Every letter, every report. A quirky tidbit about this time is that you were so insistent on this personal touch that you would often write marginal notes on official documents in your own hand. Even on subjects as mundane as the state of a minor canal or the number of new uniforms for a small garrison. You're no longer the scared boy from the Fronde. You're the sun, and everyone in France is about to feel your light. With Mazarin gone and your public persona as the Sun King solidified, it's time to make your power official. This brings us to your coronation, a ceremony you underwent as a much younger man, but which you now, as a true ruler, must embody. Your coronation was not the glittering, effortless affair you might imagine. It was a long, uncomfortable, and physically demanding ordeal that began long before the actual crown touched your head. It started with a ritualistic vigil, where you spent the entire night in prayer. Can you imagine? An all-nighter, but with a lot of kneeling and not a single energy drink in sight. This was a mainstream historical fact. The entire affair was steeped in centuries of tradition, designed to emphasize your divine connection to God. The next day, the ceremony itself was held in the Cathedral of Reims, where French kings had been crowned for 1,000 years. It was less a celebration and more a marathon of religious rites. You were anointed with holy oil, not a delicate dab, but a rather messy application to your hands, chest, head, and back. A quirky tidbit about this is that the oil was supposedly from a flask brought by a dove from heaven to anoint Clovis, the first Christian king of the Franks, in the 5th century. It was a big deal, a way to link your reign directly to the very founding of the French monarchy. After the anointing, you were presented with the royal regalia, the scepter, the hand of justice, and finally, the crown. The crown itself was heavy, far heavier than you might have anticipated, and you had to wear it for the duration of the ceremony. Then came the oaths, the promises to protect the church and your people, and the final acclamation from the crowd. All of this was happening in a massive, cold stone church, with a lot of people watching your every move. It's hard to look majestic when you're probably just wishing you could sit down and maybe get a snack. Your daily life, even after this grand ceremony, was far from leisurely. You were the most powerful man in Europe, but you were also a prisoner of ritual. Your day began with the lever du roi, the king's rising, a meticulous public ritual where courtiers were granted the immense privilege of helping you get out of bed and into your clothes. Imagine having a crowd of people watch you get dressed every morning. This wasn't about efficiency, it was about power. Everything you did, from waking up to going to bed, was a performance. Historians still argue whether you genuinely enjoyed this level of constant public attention or if you simply understood it as a necessary part of the job. A way to keep the nobility close and under control. For you, privacy was a luxury you simply didn't have. Even your religious observances, which were deeply personal, were public affairs. You attended mass daily, always with the court watching. Your piety was a huge part of your public image, a way to reinforce that divine right we talked about earlier. So, while you're ruling an empire, commanding armies, and shaping the future of Europe, you're also just a guy who has to stand through a long church service every single day. The contrast between your immense power and the mundane, repetitive nature of your daily existence is one of the most surprising parts of your story. It's less all-powerful king, and more performer trapped in a gilded cage. Your daily grind isn't just about getting up and going to church. It's a meticulously choreographed ballet of its own. With you, the Sun King, at the very center, your court is less a group of friends and more a carefully curated audience. And every single thing you do is a public spectacle. The lever du roi is just the beginning. After you are finally dressed, a process that involves dozens of nobles, each with a specific, inherited role, it's time for the petit conseil, or small council, where you meet with your most trusted ministers to discuss matters of state. But even this is not a private affair. The most privileged courtiers are allowed to attend, standing in respectful silence, their presence a testament to their proximity to power. Then, there's the hunt. It was one of your greatest passions and a key part of the royal schedule. You would ride out with a massive entourage, chasing deer and other game through the forests surrounding your palaces. This was a chance to display your physical prowess, your skill as a rider and a marksman, and to bond with your nobles in a way that didn't involve stuffy council meetings. But it was also a performance. You were always aware that you were being watched. And a good performance on the hunt was just as important as a good performance in the throne room. Historians still argue whether this obsession with hunting was a genuine love for the sport or if it was a calculated method of keeping the nobles busy and under your direct supervision. Away from the political intrigue of Paris, lunch, or Le Grand Couvert, was another public event. You would eat alone, at a table, but with an entire audience watching you. Nobles, foreign dignitaries, and even common people with the right connections could come and watch the king eat. Imagine trying to enjoy a meal while a crowd of people stares at you. A silent, expectant audience. A quirky tidbit is that you had a special spoon with a handle so long it could reach from the plate to your mouth without you having to lean forward. This was all about maintaining a regal posture and an aura of effortless superiority. You couldn't just slouch and slurp your soup, you had to eat like a king. Evenings were filled with more public performances. There were dinners, balls, theatrical performances, and card games. Everything was a chance to see and be seen. You were not just the ruler, you were the main attraction. The star of a never-ending show. You were always surrounded by people. Always on display. The very design of the court was meant to keep the nobles occupied. Competing for your attention and favor. By making every aspect of your life a public ritual, you were able to exert control over the aristocracy. Instead of plotting against you in their own castles, they were all busy vying for the honor of handing you your shirt in the morning. It was an incredibly effective way to centralize power. It's a lot to ask of a person. This constant, unyielding performance. But for you, it was just life. It was your duty, your burden, and your greatest tool. The stage for your never-ending performance needed a grander setting than the Louvre or the other smaller royal residences. This is where Versailles comes in. You probably know it as the ultimate symbol of French opulence, with its hall of mirrors and sprawling gardens. But that's not what it was like when you first started the project. For years, Versailles was just a small hunting lodge built by your father, Louis XIII. It was simple, rustic even. A quirky tidbit about this is that the lodge was known for being quite smelly due to the marshy land it was built on. A far cry from the fragrant gardens it would one day boast. This humble beginning is a mainstream historical fact, often overlooked in favor of the finished product. In the early years of your reign, Versailles was a construction site, not a palace. Imagine trying to live and work in the middle of a massive building project. There was noise, dust, and constant chaos. Historians still argue whether you began the project as a direct response to the humiliation of the Fronde. A way to build a fortress where you could control the nobility away from the unruly populace of Paris. Whatever the reason, you poured immense resources into its development. The project was not a quick one, it took decades. The scale of the undertaking was staggering. You weren't just building a palace, you were building a city. You had architects, gardeners, and thousands of laborers working constantly, all under your direct supervision. You would often go out and inspect the work yourself. A detail-oriented micromanager obsessed with every aspect of the design. For you, Versailles was a means to an end. It was a tool to centralize power and make the court revolve entirely around you. The nobility, who previously had their own power bases in their provincial castles, were now expected to live at Versailles. This meant they were always under your watchful eye, constantly competing for your attention and favor. By making attendance at court mandatory for any noble who wanted to get ahead, you effectively neutered their ability to plot against you. They were too busy with the endless social rituals and ceremonies to pose a serious threat. Remember that constant public performance we talked about? Versailles was the ultimate stage for it. It was a physical manifestation of your power. A gilded cage for the French aristocracy. So, while you might see images of the pristine Hall of Mirrors, remember that for a long time, it was a muddy, noisy, and unfinished project. It was a testament to your ambition and your genius for statecraft. But it was also a place of inconvenience and discomfort for many who lived there. It was a grand vision in the making, and you were willing to put up with a lot of dust to see it completed. Living in this world of constant spectacle and endless construction, you might wonder what life was actually like for you in your court. The answer is, not great. Especially when it came to food and personal hygiene. Your diet, while seemingly lavish, was a monotonous and unhealthy affair. A mainstream historical fact is that you had a team of hundreds of servants just to prepare your meals. But the menu was surprisingly repetitive. You ate a lot of roasted meat, often overcooked and tough, and rich sauces. There was a shocking lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, especially in the winter, which led to a lot of health problems for you and the court. Your teeth, for instance, were a constant source of pain. Dental hygiene was practically non-existent. At one point, you had almost all your upper teeth pulled, a procedure performed without proper anesthetic, which must have been an absolute nightmare. A quirky tidbit is that you had such a large abscess in your mouth that a surgeon had to cut through your palate to drain it. And the wound never fully healed, leaving you with a hole in the roof of your mouth. Imagine trying to eat with that. It's hard to look majestic when you're constantly wincing in pain. Digestion was another major issue. The rich, heavy foods and lack of fiber led to chronic constipation and other digestive troubles. Historians still argue whether the constant purges and enemas you underwent were a necessary medical treatment or a fashionable, if misguided, health trend of the time. You had a personal physician who would give you an enema every single day. A ritual that was as much a part of your daily routine as the lever du roi. This was all happening while you were trying to govern a kingdom and project an image of effortless power. The sheer discomfort you must have been in, on a daily basis, is hard to overstate. It's a very different picture from the confident, godlike figure you presented to the world. And then there was the smell. Oh, the smell. In an era before modern plumbing and sanitation, even a palace like Versailles was a fragrant nightmare. People rarely bathed, and perfume was used not to enhance a pleasant scent, but to mask an unpleasant one. The gardens of Versailles were, in part, created to serve as giant open-air latrines for the thousands of people who lived and worked there. You can't tell me that didn't affect your ability to think straight sometimes. The contrast between the aesthetic beauty of the palace and the raw, biological reality of living in it is a perfect metaphor for your reign. You created a world of immense beauty and order. But underneath it all, there was a surprisingly mundane and often grotesque reality. You were a king, yes, but you were also a man, with a very real, and often very uncomfortable, body. For a king whose every move was a public performance. Your personal relationships were also far from private. You have a queen, Maria Theresa of Spain, a political marriage arranged to cement a peace treaty. She is a gentle, pious woman, and you have a duty to be her husband and father to her children. But the marriage is a formality, a public spectacle of royal duty. Your true affections, and your public affections, lie elsewhere. A mainstream historical fact is that you had a series of official mistresses. Women who held a recognized and powerful position at court. They lived in the palace, were given titles and honors, and their children were often legitimized and brought up alongside the royal children. This system of official mistresses, or maîtresses en titre, was a strange and a surprisingly accepted part of court life. It wasn't a secret, it was a known and tolerated part of the social order. Your most famous mistress, Françoise Athénée, the Marquise de Montespan, held this position for many years. She was witty, beautiful, and ambitious. She was also, in many ways, a queen in all but name, holding court in her own apartments and exerting a great deal of influence over you and the royal family. A quirky tidbit is that she would often spend more money on her clothes and jewelry than the queen herself. A point of constant, if silent, friction. Historians still argue whether your relationships with these women were genuine love affairs or if they were a calculated means of managing the court and rewarding allies. Was it about passion, or was it about power? Probably a little of both. The queen, meanwhile, was forced to live with this public reality. She had to sit and watch as her husband openly favored another woman. Imagine the psychological toll that must have taken. She was, in many ways, a figure of pity and a symbol of royal duty. But she had a quiet strength, a deep faith, and she focused on her children and her religious observances. Her greatest source of comfort was probably her relationship with the king's first cousin, the Grand Dauphin, your son. The whole setup was an elaborate and often cruel system. These women and their children were constantly under scrutiny, their every move watched and judged by the rest of the court. There was no such thing as a private moment. Even your moments of supposed intimacy with your mistresses were public knowledge. Their comings and goings observed and reported on by the various factions at court. You were a husband, a lover, and a father, but you were also a king, and that title superseded all others. Your personal life was, In the end, just another part of the performance. A reflection of your power and your place at the center of the world. It's a pretty cold way to live. But for you, it was simply the way things were done. Not all of your diplomatic moves were grand declarations of war or carefully crafted treaties. Sometimes, a tiny detail could cause an international incident. And you learned this lesson the hard way. It all started with a simple gift from the Elector of Brandenburg. A powerful German prince, the Elector, trying to curry your favor, sent a gift that was intended to be a gesture of goodwill, a large barrel of musk. Now, musk was an incredibly valuable substance. A powerfully fragrant secretion from the male musk deer. Used to make perfume, it was a luxury item. And a generous gift. But there was a problem. The musk was delivered to you. The King of France, in its raw, unprocessed form. This is a quirky tidbit that reveals a lot about the culture of the time. The raw musk, instead of smelling like the refined perfumes of the court, had a strong, almost overwhelming, and frankly unpleasant odor. It was a potent, animalistic smell, and it was not something you, the meticulously presented Sun King, appreciated. You were so offended by the smell that you refused to accept the gift. You had the barrel of musk returned to the Elector of Brandenburg with a polite but very clear message. The king is not amused. This seemingly small incident caused a diplomatic kerfuffle. The Elector was mortified. He had meant to send a valuable and impressive gift. And it had been rejected. Publicly. This was not just a rejection of a gift, it was a rejection of his person. His judgment, and his attempt to gain your favor. Historians still argue whether this was a deliberate insult on your part. A way to show your disdain for a minor German prince. Or if you were genuinely so sensitive to bad smells that you acted on a whim. Whatever the intention, the effect was clear. The Elector of Brandenburg, a powerful military leader, was now an enemy. The incident strained the relationship between France and Brandenburg for years and contributed to a larger sense of animosity between the two states. It's a mainstream historical fact that your court was obsessed with status and etiquette. And this incident proves just how far that obsession went. A simple misunderstanding about a smell could have major political consequences. It also highlights the disconnect between the opulence of your court and the realities of the wider world. The Elector probably thought he was sending a symbol of wealth. You saw it as a barrel of unpleasantness that had no place in your palace. It's a pretty good example of how your personal tastes and preferences, no matter how petty they might seem, were always tied to the fate of your kingdom. So, the next time you think about giving a gift, you might want to consider how it smells. The diplomatic snafu with the musk was just one example of the immense importance of appearances and social codes at your court. For you and your nobles, everything was about a meticulously crafted image, and clothing was a huge part of that. The dress code at Versailles was a mind-bogglingly complex system of rules and regulations. A mainstream historical fact is that you had a team of hundreds of tailors and dressmakers working around the clock to create the extravagant silks, satins, and velvets that were worn at court. The clothes were not just for show, they were a status symbol. A way to visually display one's proximity to power. There were specific colors and fabrics reserved for certain ranks. And woe to the courtier who wore the wrong thing to the wrong event. The men's fashion was particularly elaborate, with complex lace cuffs, enormous wigs, and high-heeled shoes. A quirky tidbit is that you, King Louis XIV, were a pioneer of high heels for men. You wore them not just to make yourself appear taller, you were actually quite short, but to symbolize your status. Only the highest-ranking nobles were allowed to wear red heels, a sign of their privilege. Historians still argue whether this fashion was a brilliant political strategy to keep the nobility focused on frivolous details or if you were simply a man who loved a good pair of shoes. It probably kept a lot of people busy arguing over the proper length of a cuff, which meant they weren't busy plotting a revolution. And then there was the ongoing, unspoken issue of personal hygiene. Despite the expensive perfumes and powdered wigs, the court of Versailles was not a place of great cleanliness. People rarely bathed, and you were no exception. Your personal physician, a man who believed that water could transmit disease through the pores of the skin, advised you against bathing. So, you would take a bath maybe once or twice a year, a habit that was not unusual for the time. Instead of bathing, people would use perfumes and change their linens to mask body odor. The sheer amount of perfume being used at court must have been overwhelming. The famous gardens of Versailles, in a way, served as a gigantic air freshener for the palace itself. This contrast between the dazzling, over-the-top fashion and the complete lack of basic hygiene is a perfect example of the strange, contradictory nature of your reign. You created a world of immense order and beauty, but it was built on a surprisingly mundane and often uncomfortable reality. You were the Sun King, a symbol of power and grace, but you were also a man who had to navigate a world that was, frankly, a little stinky. The Sun King wasn't just a ruler, he was a brand. And you, Louis, were a master of marketing. You understood that art was not just for pleasure, it was a powerful tool of state propaganda. A mainstream historical fact is that you founded several royal academies, including the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture and the Royal Academy of Architecture. These institutions weren't just schools, they were a way for you to exert control over the artistic output of the entire kingdom. The art produced was designed to glorify you, your reign, and the power of France. It was a constant visual reinforcement of your authority. Take the paintings and sculptures of you. For example, you are always depicted as strong, heroic, and larger than life, often in the style of a Roman emperor or a Greek god. You commissioned countless portraits, statues, and tapestries, all designed to portray you as a divinely appointed ruler. A quirky tidbit is that you had a team of court artists whose sole job was to paint your victories. Both real and imagined. This wasn't about documenting history, it was about creating a specific narrative. A carefully curated version of events that always put you in the best possible light. Theater was another one of your favorite tools. You were a great patron of playwrights like Molière and Racine, and you had a theater built right in the palace. You would attend performances regularly, and the plays themselves often contained allegorical references to your reign, subtly praising your wisdom and power. Historians still argue whether Molière's satirical plays, which often poked fun at the nobility, were a way for you to keep the aristocrats in line or if they were just a genuine source of entertainment that you happened to enjoy. Whatever the true motivation, the effect was the same. Art was serving the state. Even the gardens of Versailles were a form of propaganda. They were a triumph of human order over the chaos of nature. A reflection of your own ability to bring order to France. The fountains, the statues, the perfectly manicured hedges, it was all a visual metaphor for your power. You weren't just a king, you were a god. And your kingdom was a reflection of your divine will. This strategic use of art and culture was one of your most enduring legacies. You turned France into a cultural powerhouse. But you did so by turning artists into instruments of the state. While you were busy crafting a perfect image of power and order at Versailles, the reality of your reign outside the palace walls was a near-constant state of war. A mainstream historical fact is that you spent a huge portion of your long reign, roughly 32 years, embroiled in conflicts. These weren't quick, glorious victories, they were long, bloody, and incredibly expensive wars. They were the War of Devolution, the Franco-Dutch War, the War of the League of Augsburg, and finally, the exhausting War of the Spanish Succession. This last one, in particular, was a grinding, multi-decade conflict fought to secure your grandson's claim to the Spanish throne. It was less about glory and more about a desperate struggle to maintain the balance of power in Europe. You, as the king, were at the center of all this. You didn't lead your troops from the front in the later years. But you were the one making the decisions, directing strategy, and negotiating treaties. A quirky tidbit is that you had a very specific, almost theatrical, way of receiving military dispatches. A messenger would arrive at Versailles, often covered in mud and exhausted from a long ride, and you would receive them in your study, sometimes even in the middle of the night. This was a very deliberate show of your dedication to the war effort. A way to project an image of a tireless leader. Historians still argue whether your involvement in these wars was a necessary defense of France's interests or a display of hubris that ultimately drained the country's resources and left it weakened. These wars had a profound and lasting impact on France. The constant need for money meant heavy taxation, and the French people, far from the glittering halls of Versailles, suffered immensely. You were building the most magnificent palace in the world while your subjects were struggling to feed their families. The human cost was staggering. with hundreds of thousands of lives lost. The glory of a new territory or a successfully negotiated peace treaty probably felt pretty hollow to the families who had lost sons, fathers, and brothers. By the time you reach your later years, you are a king who has outlived most of your friends, your family, and your greatest military commanders. The seemingly endless wars have taken a toll on both you and your country. The glorious image of the Sun King is starting to show its cracks. And a sense of weariness, both personal and national, begins to set in. The weight of these long, bloody wars and the constant performance you've been living since childhood begins to take a toll. You are a king, a godlike figure to your people, but you are also just a man, and the psychological burden is immense. You've lived your entire life in public. There is no such thing as a private moment, a quiet retreat where you can just be yourself. Even your personal grief is a public spectacle. When your son, the Grand Dauphin, dies in 1711, followed by his son and heir, and then his wife and eldest son, all within the span of a few years, your court watches your every move. You are expected to show a certain level of regal stoicism, but you are also a father and a grandfather in deep mourning. The pressure to maintain this persona, to not show any cracks in the facade, must have been overwhelming. This constant performance is a mainstream historical fact, the central paradox of your reign. You created a system where you were the unquestioned center of everything. But in doing so, you became a prisoner of your own creation. A quirky tidbit is that you had a very specific way of dealing with your personal grief. You would retreat to your private apartments, not to be alone, but to be with your second wife, Madame de Maintenon. She was a woman you married in secret after the death of your first wife. A testament to the fact that you still craved some form of personal connection. Even if it had to be a secret, historians still argue whether this marriage was a genuine love match or a pragmatic alliance. Either way, it was a rare moment of personal choice in a life dictated by public duty. The constant need to be on has a lasting effect on you. You're no longer the vigorous, dancing Sun King of your youth. You are an old man, burdened by war, grief, and the immense weight of your crown. You find solace not in grand balls or military campaigns, but in a quiet routine. You spend your days with your small family, attending religious services, and working tirelessly at your desk. Still a micromanager to the very end. The glamour of Versailles is still there, but it's a hollow echo of its former glory. The palace is filled with whispers of succession crises and the fear of what will happen after you are gone. You are a king, but you are also a very old man, watching your world slowly crumble around you. And there's nothing you can do about it. The golden cage of Versailles has become your final home. Your final years are a slow, painful decline, a stark and unglamorous contrast to the powerful image you had cultivated for so long. The physical ailments that had plagued you throughout your life, the dental problems, the digestive issues, only get worse. A mainstream historical fact is that you developed gangrene in your leg, a condition that was both excruciatingly painful and, in that era, almost always fatal. The doctors, as they were, tried a series of increasingly bizarre and ineffective treatments. They attempted to lance the infected area, a procedure that must have been agonizing. There's a quirky tidbit that during one of these procedures, you were told to have a servant hold your hand to keep you from screaming. You refused, saying, "A king doesn't cry." It's a testament to the iron will you maintained even at the very end. The gangrene slowly spread, and the pain became constant. The physical reality of your decline was a public spectacle. Just like everything else in your life, you had a duty to die in public. With your court watching, your doctors would come and go, offering their useless advice, and your family would gather around your bedside. Historians still argue whether your suffering was exacerbated by the medical treatments of the time, which often did more harm than good, or if your body was simply giving out after a lifetime of immense pressure and poor hygiene. Probably a bit of both. You, who had so carefully controlled every aspect of your public image, were now powerless to control your own body. You, who had once danced as the sun, were now confined to a bed, a prisoner in your own flesh. The glorious palace of Versailles, the ultimate symbol of your power, became a quiet, somber place. The endless parties and balls were replaced by hushed conversations and the somber procession of doctors and priests. The end was a long, drawn-out affair, You were not a king who died in battle or in the prime of your life. You were an old man, weakened by illness and age. Your death, when it finally came, was a slow whimper, not a roar. The sun was setting, and the world was watching. The Sun King's final moments were not a blaze of glory, but a quiet, almost anticlimactic end. On September 1st, 1715, just 4 days before his 77th birthday, you finally succumbed to the gangrene that had been consuming your body. You, who had so meticulously crafted every aspect of your life, from your clothing to your court, left this world not with a roar, but with a quiet gasp. This is a mainstream historical fact. The end of a reign that had lasted for 72 years. The longest in European history. Your final words, spoken to your great-grandson and heir, the future Louis XV, were a poignant and honest reflection on a life lived as a king. You are soon to be a great king. Do not imitate me in the taste that I have had for building, nor in that which I have had for war. Try, on the contrary, to live in peace with your neighbors. The immediate aftermath of your death was, in a strange way, a sense of relief for many. Your reign had been long and burdensome, filled with endless wars and heavy taxes. The French people, who had suffered for so long, welcomed the change. A quirky tidbit is that as your funeral procession left Versailles and made its way toward the royal necropolis at Saint-Denis, the crowd in Paris actually cheered. It was a shocking and brutal sign of the public's exhaustion with your reign and a stark contrast to the glorious image you had so carefully cultivated. Historians still argue whether this reaction was a sign of the deep animosity the French people felt toward you personally or if it was simply a collective celebration of the end of a long and difficult era. Your legacy, however, is a complex and enduring one. You left France with a centralized state, a professional army, and a cultural influence that would dominate Europe for a century. The Palace of Versailles, once a muddy construction site, became a symbol of your power and a template for royal residences across the continent. You had tamed the nobility, but you had also created a rigid and extravagant court that was completely out of touch with the struggles of the French people. Your wars had expanded France's borders, but they had also plunged the country into crippling debt. A financial crisis that would ultimately lead to the French Revolution just a few decades later. You were, in many ways, the architect of your own destruction, laying the groundwork for the very thing that would topple your dynasty. You were a king who had shaped a nation, but in doing so, you had also created the seeds of its downfall. And so, the sun finally sets on the Sun King. Now, as the final echo of the Sun King's long, complicated life fades away, let's take a deep breath together. Inhale the cool, quiet air, and let it fill your lungs. Exhale slowly, letting all the images of a cold, dirty, and surprisingly mundane palace drift away. You are no longer in that time machine, no longer a silent observer of a king's difficult life. You are here, now, safe and warm. That's it, just let the last of it go. The heavy clothes, the creaking carriage, the silent, watching crowds, they're all gone now. You're just you, and you're ready for rest. You can let your mind relax, your muscles soften. There's no more history to remember tonight. Just the gentle hum of your fan, the dim light, and the peaceful stillness of the room. It's time to close your eyes.